Well, hi, I'm Laurence Kubiak, and I'm a New Zealander who went away straight after university and had an executive career in the blue chips overseas. First of all in the energy industry and then latterly in ICT, telecom. I started reporting to boards in those years in London, and I've been back in New Zealand now for about 12 years, and that's when I crossed the table and became a director myself. Also a business owner. I've been building a group in electronics, which is where I'm sitting at the moment, and I've done two CEO roles as well since I came back to New Zealand. So that's a very, very quick pen portrait of me.
That must mean that I first met you when you first got back to New Zealand, when you were CEO of NZIER.
It would, yes. That was my first role when I came back to New Zealand. That's correct, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mark Manicevic. Welcome to Governance Bites, and today, as you just heard, I have the absolute pleasure of spending time with Laurence Kubiak. Laurence, thank you very much for your time. Today we're going to talk about governance for value creation. As I said, we first met when you were CEO of NZIER a little over a decade ago, and one of the things that I really enjoyed, I think I first met you when you had done the piece of research for Sovereign. And there was a panel discussion that you were on, and I really enjoy listening to you when you speak, and I'd love to be able to do, that's my goal, to be able to do what you do when you speak publicly. Is one, you use a lot of salient quotes, and I love that, and the other one is bring in historical anecdotes that fit the situation, and I really admire that. So I'm enjoying the opportunity to have a conversation with you. Thank you.
That's just a function of being terribly old. You remember more than you actually know.
Well, our first question today, the governance for value creation. Can we start by defining the topic? What do you mean practically when you're talking about governance for value creation?
Well, I think it's a fundamental part of being a director, of being on a board. If we think first of all of what value creation is, so you create value when you take an asset and you move it from a lower value use to a higher valued use, either through some transformation in the asset or some combination with other assets. But that's what it is. When you do that, you've created value that wasn't there beforehand. Now, at the most fundamental level, that's what a board is there to do. You know, the board is there as stewards of the business. So, you know, our objective as board members should always be to take the situation that we inherited from the previous directors and hand it on to the next directors better, improved, more valuable. So that's value creation. You know, that gap in the middle is value creation. So as board members, as directors, we need to be always thinking, we've got this thing, we've got this collection of assets now, how could it be better? How could it be generating more value? And that's quite distinct from the role of the executive, of the managers of the business, because they're about managing the assets that you really have. You know, so they're managing for maximum efficiency, for maximum return. Because they're doing that, you know, they're in the weeds, as you might say. You know, they're very close to those assets. It's actually hard to lift yourself above that and think, you know, what else could we be doing with the assets that we have. And they're on the shorter term cycles. You know, I need to be delivering my shareholder number this month, this quarter, and so that generates a certain short term focus. That's correct. We need that. We need both. But that's why you have a board, because the board is sort of at one remove from that, and they're thinking of the assets and what they could be and what the organisation could be, and they're trying to bring that could be about. They're trying to make that real. So I think value creation is actually fundamental to what a board does and what a board should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Many boards still focus heavily on compliance and risk, particularly with the liability that sits around being directors. How should directors reframe governance to focus more on that value creation rather than being, are we safe?
Well, compliance and risk matter, of course. You know, you certainly can't ignore them. And again, playing a part in managing the risks to the business is very important. It's a very, very important function for directors. But again, it's that short-term risk versus long-term risk is really where the difference lies. So if, as a director, you're not thinking about innovation, you're not thinking about how the market is traveling, you're not thinking about how the things that people value in the market is changing, then then you're not really doing your job, you know. So, and that's a different kind of risk assessment to the sort of thing that an asset manager in a business would be doing. It's always, how is this travelling? What's the future thing? What's the future risk that we need to have our eyes on now, so that we can get ahead of the curve?
How do you then manage if you were to come onto a board of directors and then discover that they're very focused on risk and compliance and not thinking so much about that value creation and the future of the business? How do you then manage that situation or that transition to a more value creating board?
It's been my good fortune not to have been in that position very often. The danger signs are, are you getting a lot of reporting? Lots of operational reporting, lots of operational KPIs that don't actually line up with the strategic outcomes that you're meant to be managing as a board member. So there are some practices that can help. Northpower, which is one of my boards, has a very, very good practice actually, where they just put the strategic stuff up front in the board pack. So if you think of a more traditional board meeting where you might turn up and you review the minutes first and sign the compliance statements, whatever it might be, we do all that stuff at the end. The strategic discussion is always up front, where people's attention is strongest and where their focus is strongest. And to always have that as the first one or two items in a board meeting, I think is a very good practice. It does keep certainly the board focused in the right place.
That's a common theme that I'm getting through these conversations. So it must be becoming more and more common to have those strategic conversations first and all the operational stuff.
I'm glad
later.
to hear that, because I in my experience, it's not universal, but if it's becoming more common, that's very good.
Yeah, so fingers crossed. I haven't done a survey to find out just how much it is, but certainly the people I'm speaking to are saying, this is the way that we should be doing it, and the way that we do it, which is great. In terms of inputs and process, what distinguishes boards that truly create value from those that simply oversee the performance of the business?
Well, I spoke of it just now. If they're excessively focused on that operational reporting, that's not a good sign. I have a particular bugbear, and this is a battle I know I'm losing, but the increasing prominence of PowerPoint presentations in board packs. I don't think they're a substitute for a good, well thought out paper. They put you into sort of reactive mode because someone's presenting to you, whereas the idea of a paper is it stimulates a discussion, and the board meeting is really about the discussion, about the challenge, about the different perspectives that can be brought to bear. Mine is a vote for no PowerPoint presentation in board meetings, but I think I've lost that battle.
But you'll keep fighting it?
I'll keep fighting, yes. Look, when I started reporting to boards in London, we actually had a page limit on board papers, and if you couldn't get it down to less than 6 pages and no funky stuff with fonts and margins, there was a template. then you had to break up the decision. And that was actually a very good discipline and a very good habit. So I think some of that thinking has been lost. The other great element in all this is the relationship with the CEO. I mean, where that's not working well, you can imagine a situation where the CEO is just the sort of reporter. He's reporting all the results to the board, and that's the meeting. The CEO needs to be a partner. I mean, he's that linchpin between the board and the executive, and so the board needs to see him as a partner. And I think it's a much better practice if he doesn't actually do much of the reporting of results. If he allows his people to come and do that when appropriate, and he sort of stands behind it, because that preserves a certain detachment for him as well. So there are a number of things that are just process things that you can do to move you from the sort of board that's sort of basically a committee board, if you know what I mean, the school committee or whatever it might be, to a more future-focused strategic board that's really driving for value creation across time, across generations.
Yeah, thank you. That's awesome. How can boards ensure that they're spending enough time on long-term strategic value and not just quarterly performance? You mentioned some of this about having the strategic conversations up front. You've mentioned about the role of the CEO in that. Are there any other thoughts around how boards can ensure that they're focusing on that long-term?
I think it's very important for boards to have the courage to be willing to trade off short-term returns for longer-term value creation. Now, oftentimes, particularly with a publicly owned board, a listed board, that's hard because particularly if it's a yield share, then the investors are going to be wanting their return regularly. But I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. If we turn some things off that are generating returns in the short term, in order to put the resource, the capital, whatever it might be, the capital, the people, into something that's more valuable in the long term, that's the sign of a mature board that's focusing on the right things.
Yeah, okay. What governance practices help boards to challenge management thinking constructively without becoming operational?
That's a very good question. It's a very good thing if management asks for it. So I've occasionally seen papers where the management has said, we want board challenge here, and here on whatever the issues might be. So, please test our thinking on these points.
Yes.
So something like that is good. I think it's very good to steel man the next best alternative to whatever the decision that you're making is. So a bit like a devil's advocate sort of approach, or not quite. So, your preferred option is this, but you've got the second option here. Steel man that and keep asking those why questions about, why is what we're doing here better than what we're doing here? And not everything will be better. So that will take you into, well, what trade-offs are we making by taking this approach instead of that approach? So I think that kind of process is extremely valuable. I've black hat reviews, which are more often used at the management at the management layer, but I think that they can be very effective with boards as well, particularly if you bring in an external expert to be your black hat for whatever it is that's under this discussion. That can be extremely valuable. The other more general point, I guess, is one of the points of having a board is you've got a variety of perspectives around the board table, different backgrounds, different technical backgrounds, different professional disciplines, different industries. That's a great basis for challenge. And naturally, if you're contrasting that with the executive of the organisation, they're much more likely to be experts in that industry. And so to be able to bring those other perspectives to bear on that internal expertise, again, it's a very, very valuable source of challenge, and it shouldn't be discounted. I get a bit dispirited, actually, when I see boards that, seem to be entirely composed of Shortland Street lawyers and an accountant. I just think, well, where's the divergent thinking going to come from here? Who's got the scars on their back to actually bring those scars to bear on an important decision?
Yes. Actually, that leads quite nicely into the next question around culture. How does the board oversight of culture and leadership influence that long-term organisational value?
Oh, golly, that's a huge question to which I wish I had a better answer. So if I were sitting here representing the AICD or the New Zealand Institute of Directors, they'd all be quoting Peter Drucker and saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I can think of organisations which I think have quite suboptimal cultures which still do very well. Is the hard truth. Obviously, we want the best culture that we can have in our organisations, but it doesn't always lead automatically to value creation. Is the bitter truth. So I'm a bit of a skeptic about that. I think you can do valuable things to encourage culture, though. So you mentioned directors' duties just now, and the obligations on directors following the 2016 Act. Health and safety. I mean, it's important for the board to set the signal and the chief executive to set the signal from the very top about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and to act upon that. So you can do that sort of thing where it's a tightly defined element of culture, such as health and safety, and that's extremely valuable. But if your definition of culture is we want to be running a place where people love coming to work, and there are donuts in the kitchen, and everybody's happy, it doesn't always lead to results directly through any mechanism that I've been able to identify. I wish it did, because on the personal level I'm completely bought into that, but on the sort of experiential level I think it's pretty murky.
Right. No, that's a really interesting to know. Thank you. How can this is actually a question that relates to the long-term, short-term value creation that we talked about before. How can boards ensure that management is allocating capital in ways that maximise that long-term value rather than short-term gains?
I'm always disappointed, and it often happens. The usual situation is that companies tend to underspend their capital programs. So you go through the budgeting exercise and you say, yes, we've nailed up this capital for you in the following year for these purposes, go and spend it. And it's often adrift by the end of the first quarter, often underspent. I think it's just important to really keep up the pressure on that, because you're allocating capital to provide future value. It's either defensive or it's to provide some kind of future value. And so it's important to keep those those projects on track. Beyond that, I think the standard financial metrics that you use to measure these things on the long, NPV and IRR, are pretty good, and they're probably as much as you need to inform decision making, unless it's an out-and-out transformation that you're a real pivot that you're taking the organization through. If that's the case, then you probably need a completely different set of tools that says, okay, we were this, and now we're going to be that, and you measure this and using A, B, and C, and you measure that using X, Y, and Z, and so your task is then how do you cut over from A, B, and C to X, Y, and Z, and that's a difficult but very interesting task. But obviously that's capital and resource allocation will get you there.
Right, and so one of the things I take from that is the importance of the analysis of data to understand how the capital is being allocated, how efficiently it's being allocated, as you say, is it being spent, and what are the expected returns on that, and then presumably post capital use, did it deliver the returns that it promised? And
that's a bit that's often missing. So the sort of after action review. We thought A, B, and C would happen. We got X, Y, and Z, Y. I mean, it happens at the executive level as well. I think after each program completes, both immediately and at a distance, an appropriate distance, depending on the nature of the program, we thought we would get these things out of this spend. Did we? If we didn't, why not? What did we miss, and feed that back into the system. I think those after-action reviews are a very, very good practice, and should be more common. It's a shame they're not more common than they are.
True. What board capabilities are the most important in driving value in today's organisations?
I think that diversity of experience is very important. Because having those different people around the board table that look at the world in different ways is, as I say, something that you tend not to get in the same way from the executive. That's very important. I think you need a chair that focuses the board on that value creation and the future story and that trajectory. It's very easy to lose sight of that. So a chair who's always got that as front of mind, I think very, very valuable. Those would be the main ones, I think. But yeah, board composition is really important.
Yes.
Very important. And as I said earlier, I would want, looking at New Zealand now, and I guess Australia as well, I would want to see more people around board tables with more scars on their backs from operational businesses than perhaps is more usual at the moment. A journalist asked me that once, actually. What do you think is the most important qualification for a director? I said scars.
Yeah, right.
Having made tough decisions and having to live with the results, or course correct if you had to, that's really what makes the difference.
Right, that's really interesting. One of the things I would love to see is some good research around that diversity and the value.
Yeah, there's lots of bad research around it.
And
I'm looking at you, Mackenzie.
I think one of the things that gets me as well is that often the research around diversity, certainly over the last, when I last looked at it when I was at the FMA, it was around things that were very easy to measure, such as gender.
Yes.
And as you say, it's what's the diversity of background, and I don't see a lot of researchers say how many lawyers are on the board, how many accountants, how many engineers, and that's kind of the research that we need, is to see that breadth of experience.
I feel so. I mean, gonads and melatonin don't get me very excited personally. I mean, I used to flippantly say that the quickest way to get groupthink around a board table was to implement a board diversity, equity and inclusion strategy, because you'll get people who think the same oftentimes if you do that. But looking at different backgrounds, different experiences, different organizations, scales of organization, different industries, different countries, as long as they have something to bring to bear on the core business of the organization. I mean, you just don't want, difference for the sake of difference. No. It's got to have some relevance, some angle of relevance. That's where the magic happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I've one question for you then. There's been a couple of really nice insights that have come out, or a few, more than a couple, from our conversation so far. So if you could nail it down to one, if you could change one governance practice across all boards tomorrow to improve value creation, what would that change be?
Probably putting the strategy up front.
Right.
Such a simple thing to do.
Very
easy to implement. But it sends a message both to the executive and to the board that this is what we're here to do in these meetings. The operational thing's fine. We need some reporting on that just to make sure that everything's broadly on track. But our job is to take this thing and move it into the future in a better state than the state in which we inherited it. And to do that's strategy, and we need to keep onto that and focus on that before we focus on anything else.
Yeah, right, that's great. And one final question for you that is more general. What's the best advice you've received as a director over your career?
I don't know if it's as a director, but it's, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. They are to be used in that proportion. And I'm conscious in this interview, I seem to have been doing a lot of talking, but yeah, listen to understand, listen to comprehend, and when you're ready, don't make your contribution until you really feel you're ready to make it. You will have seen this a lot. The new directors tend to be a bit noisy. That's partly unfamiliarity, but partly it's, they feel they need to make an impact straight away often, and so they get noisy. Fight against that. The listen, learn, understand, and then reflect on your own experience and how that Venn diagram works. And then maybe in your second or third, fourth meeting, you'll be able to make a meaningful contribution if you've been through that quiet period at the beginning.
Laurie, it's been really cool to catch up. Thank you so much for your time. I'll look forward to catching up again soon.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of Governance Bites. We have more episodes on YouTube and your favourite podcast channel, where I interview directors and experts on various topics relating to boards of directors and governance. We'd love to see you back, and please like, subscribe, and share the videos and podcasts.